The following news flash is brought to you by the Lone Star Lowdown. Markets for Monday, the 16th of May, 2016, are currently trading with gold at $1,272.20 an ounce, silver $17.12 an ounce, Texas crude $46.21 a barrel, and Bitcoin is currently sitting at about 458 U.S. currency. Today in history, the year 1918. The Sedition Act is passed by U.S. Congress, making criticism of the government an imprisonable offense. An expansion of the Espionage Act of 1917, it banned speech and the expression of opinion that cast the government or the war effort in a negative light, of course excused by the perceived interference with the sale of government bonds. The end of free speech in the U.S. during wartime. Today in history. In recent news, a Texas openly gay church pastor, Jordan Brown, wrote in a statement today that Whole Foods, the company, did nothing wrong. This after he back in April had requested a cake from the all-natural organic grocery store with the phrase "Love wins" on it, but then claimed that he received a cake with an added homophobic slur. Brown said in the statement today, quote, "I want to apologize to Whole Foods and its team members for questioning the company's commitment to its values, and especially the baker associate who I understand was put in a terrible position because of my actions. I apologize to the LGBT community for diverting attention from real issues. I also want to apologize to my partner, my family, my church family, and my attorney." Whole Foods filed a countersuit against Brown and hasn't stated whether it would drop the action now that Brown has dropped his frivolous lawsuit. The University of Miami has detected a radioactive isotope produced by nuclear reactors in Biscayne Bay, spiking at 200 times higher than normal level at the Turkey Point nuclear power plant located just south of Miami, confirming suspicion that Turkey Point's aging canals are leaking into the nearby national park. South Miami Mayor Philip Stoddard, who is also a biological science professor at the Florida International University, told the Miami New Times, quote, "You would have to work hard to find a worse place to put a nuclear plant right between two national parks and subject to hurricanes and storm surge." Laura Reynolds, an environmental consultant who worked with the Tropical Audubon Society and the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, which intends to file a lawsuit, stated that, quote, "We know now exactly where the pollution is coming from, and we have a tracer that shows it is in the national park. We are worried about the marine life there and the future of the Biscayne Bay." This leak comes only several months after New York Governor Andrew Cuomo acknowledged that the state's Indian Point nuclear facility was leaking tritium into the local groundwater. The Indian Point nuclear power plant is located on the Hudson River, approximately 25 miles north of New York City, and serves the electrical needs of an estimated 2 million people. This is Rick Brody with your lowdown for May 16th, 2016.
Rise up, children. Remember the victims. Look within you.
Welcome to the Vaccine Myth, an issue of trust. Today is Sunday, the 29th day of May, 2016, and I'm your host, Sean Siegel. Hello to everyone listening on LogosRadioNetwork.com or here in Austin, Texas on 89.1 or 90.1 FM, and anyone else who may be picking up the signal. We have no guests today, but plenty of information. I had invited Marcy Piper Terry on, but she is to co-host, that is. But she is participating in the Autism One conference that is ongoing, and hopefully in the next week or two she'll join me to co-host. Indeed, if I remember right, one of her videos is one of the ones I played last week, or I should have. She put together, I guess she gave one long interview after the march on the CDC in Atlanta last summer, and that's been broken up into several different segments. But the one that I think I appreciate most is the one in which she says they think we're so stupid that we don't understand the difference between injection and ingestion. And she says it so matter-of-factly. And just the way she expresses it, she makes the people that are, in essence, trying to convince all society that there is no difference look, in turn, so stupid. Because it is. It's an absurdity. I can't say that I thought about it before 7 years ago at this point when I started researching vaccines, and most people don't think about it. Why? Because of that cognitive dissonance, that pervasive cognitive dissonance that doesn't allow us to very easily consider the prospect that the people we've been taught to trust since childhood, since infancy, if we can remember back that far, in regards to our health, and the people who are entrusted to oversee the nation's health cannot be trusted. It's well past the point where they're simply making mistakes. They're not incompetent, they're dishonest. And we have to ask ourselves constantly, what is the motivation behind this? Because where indeed, if the motivation is simply monetary greed, it's dastardly and nefarious. But if the motivation is the harm that's being done, if the motivation is literally genocide and eugenics, then it's a whole other ballgame. It doesn't lessen the harm being done, but it certainly clarifies why it's being done and the fact that we should be much, much more concerned about the entire vaccine paradigm. And not only the vaccine paradigm, but all of those other societal disorders which we can't escape. Everything from chemtrails to GMO food to the absurd laws being put in place. Certainly, primarily regarding this show, the laws relating to vaccines, but there's so many others. I think I'll point out that polio, I mean, I was thinking just before the show, why is it that I can sit and eat a big slice of watermelon before I go on air on a Sunday such as today and not be concerned, though there are no guests, with what there is to convey to the audience? Because it's such a pervasive part of my thinking and my being. Ever since 7 years ago, I was told by Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, along with 10 others in a private seminar, that the CDC had radically changed the definition of polio, in essence following on the heels of the release of the Salk vaccine. And that became not an obsession, but a focus of mine for a while. First thing I did, of course, was try to corroborate and check the validity. And, of course, it's true. They not only changed the literal definition, the diagnostic parameters of paralytic polio, they also changed the way what was recorded as non-paralytic polio, but reported simply as polio, was labeled. They eliminated, they deleted the label of non-paralytic polio from the diagnostic dictionary. And close to 60% of all the cases of polio that up until that time had been reported on an annual basis were automatically eliminated by that one change. Because unbeknownst to the American public, because it simply wasn't highlighted, it was never focused, it was never underscored by the government. The reports each year included numbers for polio for the previous year, but never mentioned that 58% of those were non-paralytic. And the American public, of course, assumed that they were paralytic. And then with the radical change they made to the definition of paralytic polio, they eliminated another 30% or so. In a nutshell, right at 90% of all subsequent polio diagnoses were eliminated by the changes made in 1955, right after the Salk vaccine was released. They even went so far as to change the definition of a polio epidemic, cutting pretty much in half the likelihood that any subsequent outbreaks of polio would be labeled an epidemic. As though overnight the importance, the significance of polio, or the severity of polio had changed. I don't know how to word it. What a bizarre change to make. It's like saying, oh, don't worry about it today. It was worrisome yesterday, but, well, it may be worrisome today, but only half as much so. I mean, how ridiculous. And the only reason they get away with it is because they've got the power to do it. They control public perception with the point of their pen. They lead the American public around like a little dog chasing what it considers is vital information concerning the health of their children. When it's statistical manipulation, such as just mentioned, Same type of shenanigans go on in regard to the other ways to report the effectiveness of vaccines. Certainly, the constant characterization of vaccines as safe is a total sham, because pretty much every parent at least wants to interpret that to mean that their child will not be harmed by a vaccine, and that's absolutely not the case. As we know, over $3 billion have been awarded for vaccine injuries, including transverse myelitis, meningitis, cardiac arrest, death, Guillain-Barré syndrome, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. And what is also the tip of the iceberg is the number of actual injuries versus the number of injuries that are compensated. Health and Human Services tells us that, quote, only a small fraction, unquote, of actual vaccine reactions are ever reported. And we can tell you pretty much assuredly, with much confidence, from everything that I've read and the many, many parents I've interviewed over this last 4 years, that that figure is much closer to 1% than 10%, if not less than 1%. So we can only assume that had all actual adverse vaccine reactions over the last 30 years, over the life of the reportage of the VAERS database, been duly reported and compensated, that what is now a total of several billions having been paid in compensation for those injuries would amount to tens, if not hundreds of billions. And unfortunately, that makes way too much sense. So the reason I can feel confident eating my slice of watermelon in a few minutes before the show starts is because I can't let go of these poignant figures and facts. Because I can't let go still the fact that we actually are literally, consciously, purposely, and purposefully poisoning kids with the vaccines the CDC recommends for administration starting on the day of birth. And so, to make a long story short, I think I'm the only one who's gone so far as to put this type of figure to the polio reality, that over the last 60 years, more than 1 million cases of what would have been reported as polio in 1954 have been relabeled and called aseptic meningitis, viral meningitis, Guillain-Barré syndrome, Bell's palsy, and any other of the several diseases, another handful of diseases, among the constellation of symptoms of which is included flaccid paralysis. And certainly acute flaccid paralysis is another one of those diseases. But every year, anywhere from 10,000 to 60,000, depending on the estimate you end up accessing, cases of meningitis, Guillain-Barré syndrome, and all those other diseases I mentioned are reported annually. And that's been going on for 60 years. Over 1 million cases of a disease we've been told is eradicated in the U.S. have taken place the way they were defined and reported before the vaccine came out. That's an accurate statement of the way public perception of polio has been manipulated. I'll be back after the first break, 2 minutes.
You are listening to the Logos Radio Network, LogosRadioNetwork.com.
Okay, this video I'm going to play now, it's brief, and I will follow it up with by reading a transcript from the same woman. I'm speaking about an MD specifically, Dr. Rachel Ross, who apparently is one of the regulars on the daytime mainstream television show, The Doctors. And, of course, Del Bigtree, who is the producer of, one of the main producers of the film Vaxxed, also came from The Doctors, the same show. He left that show, left Hollywood once he realized what was happening in the world of vaccines, once his eyes were opened to all the manipulation and skullduggery that I referenced in the first segment. So Dr. Ross is now much more aware than she was apparently just a few weeks ago. The movie Vaxxed is really making waves. There's been reports of pediatricians walking out of the movie crying, as I mentioned last week, literally weeping, now aware of how many of their young patients they may have seriously harmed by vaccinating them, with the vaccines which they urged and insisted. But I'm going to pick up this video is, I think it's at the Autism One conference, but it is Dr. Rachel Ross, and Marcy Piper Terry in the audience had just spoken to her and asked her a question, how do you feel, how can you explain how you feel now about vaccines as opposed to what you previously thought? And this was her response.
I want to go back to other positions. They don't teach us that. As a matter of fact, it's all kind of like a haze. No, they don't teach us about the ingredients. They don't teach us about the studies behind it. I think what they teach us is that they've always been given and that they cure diseases and that you just do it.
Okay, so at least part of Marcy's question obviously was, what were you taught in medical school about vaccines? And of course, you just answered, in essence, nothing but what we're told in the mainstream. Nothing about ingredients, nothing about the harm they do, etc.
And honestly, from the outside looking in now, and as we're saying this to all you people, I almost feel like an ass.
Okay, what she said was, on the outside looking in now and telling all you people, and of course she's talking to all these people, half of whom had autistic kids, which she'll broach in just a second. And she said, I'm sitting here talking to you and telling you this, and I feel like an ass. And she's very humble and straightforward in this. And let's let her continue.
No, it's kind of like, are there any other doctors in here in practicing medicine? Yeah, it's kind of like you just feel, you wake up one day and you just feel like, gosh, I just am blindly like a robot following through with this with no real data, no real information, didn't know what was in them. And so, that's part of what makes us all feel really bad. And it's part of why physicians are very resistant to this information, because you have to sit at home, right? You have to sit at home and redigest and relearn everything that you learned and come to terms with the damage that you potentially caused to you. So
you have to sit at home, she says, as an MD, and she was talking kind of in conversation with another MD who apparently was in the audience, whom she called out there. And she said, you have to sit at home and contemplate what's going on and come to terms with the damage you've done. Just amazing. It's a pleasure to see this type of awareness taking place. And I'm going to read now apparently a Facebook post which this same MD, Dr. Ross, put on her Facebook page. Okay, verbatim. It's been an interesting weekend. It's opening weekend here in Chicago for the Vaxxed documentary. I was interviewed for the documentary, and my involvement started with me responding honestly on camera to documents and research surrounding the MMR vaccine, African-American boys, and autism. Sure, you can interview me. Sure, I'll look at the documents. Just my honest gut feelings as a black physician and a black mom. This weekend, the theater has been filled with parents of vaccine-injured kids. It's been difficult emotionally. At the beginning of the panel, they asked all the parents who had a vaccine-injured child to stand. And when I tell you my heart dropped when half the audience stood, that would be an understatement. Black and white, Latina and other, all standing in solidarity, united by this one life-altering event. And honestly, one of the hardest parts has been these exhausted parents coming up to me at the end and calling me a hero for what I said during the documentary. Can you really be considered a hero for saying and doing the right thing? If so, we need more heroes out there. So when Vaxxed hits the theater in your town, make sure you see it, because it just might change your heart and your mind about vaccine-related injuries and autism, and you might just become the hero we need to push for more answers. And as I say, I mean, this is obviously, also obviously I was wrong about her participation. I have not seen the film yet. She apparently participated in the film as well, but when she did start reviewing all that documentation, that is a major focus indeed of the film, she obviously was awakened to vaccine injury and awakened to the pervasiveness thereof when she did ask for the audience members who had autistic kids to raise their hands, and half of them, that people in the audience, raised their hands. I've seen comments, too, that were made in some of the articles following the March on Atlanta last year. One of the outcomes of which was a definite raising of awareness in the black population, since indeed the major point of contention, the most significant point of contention in the results found when they did collect the data regarding the MMR autism study that the CDC conducted in 2002 was a significant, to say the least, a remarkable 240% greater chance of autism diagnosis in black boys specifically. Not just blacks, but black boys specifically, when they received the MMR vaccine at the recommended 12 to 18 months instead of at 36 months. But I always am compelled to add that's not all there was. There was a 50% greater chance across the board, regardless of race, under the same situation, MMR administered at 12 to 18 months instead of 36 for all kids, regardless of gender or race. And this was for what they call isolated autism, which is a common form. It's autism that doesn't come with attendant diagnoses of other types of neurological disorders. So this was terribly, terribly significant. And understandably is raising the eyes of many, many, many people nationwide. It continues to expand and playing. One of the videos took place in Compton, California, where the Reverend Tony Muhammad was there, I believe from the Nation of Islam. I believe that's correct. And they were speaking about the movie now being translated into Spanish, Chinese, and many other languages. So it will make its way internationally, as it must do, as just a beginning of a global awakening. And of course, you know, Robert De Niro is planning on his own vaccine documentary, and one more that I'll speak about when we come back.
Radio frequency identification, or RFID, is a technology that tracks things at a distance. When the things being monitored are fish, there can be surprising results. I'm Dr. Catherine Albrecht, and I'll reveal the downside to chipping salmon in just a moment.
Your search engine is watching you, recording all your searches and creating a massive database of your personal information. That's creepy, but it doesn't have to be that way. Startpage.com is the world's most private search engine. Startpage doesn't store your IP address, make a record of your searches, or use tracking cookies, and they're third-party certified. If you don't like Big Brother spying on you, start over with Startpage. Great search results and total privacy. Startpage.com, the world's most private search engine.
Birds that eat salmon from the Columbia River are getting an unwanted side order of chips. Fish and game workers have been injecting salmon with RFID tags since 1986 as a way to track them as they navigate the river's maze of hydroelectric dams. Birds can't digest the glass-encapsulated chips, so they excrete them with their droppings. Ugh. Hundreds of thousands of the chips litter their nesting grounds, causing their island habitats to glisten in the sunlight. While the birds might find the glare annoying, they're reportedly not harmed by this game, but there's no word on how all that high-tech litter will get cleaned up or what impact it has on the environment. I'm Dr. Catherine Albrecht. More news and information at CatherineAlbrecht.com.
You are listening to the Logos Radio Network, LogosRadioNetwork.com.
right. I don't expect to be treated like a fool no more. I don't expect to sleep through the night. So
well, since after a busy conversation with Nate, the producer, during the break, I have no idea exactly what I was going to tell you guys when we came back in. I'm going to go right to, let's see, I wanted to play this last week and never had a chance. This is Andy Wakefield's video, and it was produced relatively recently. Now, he's got all this information out in other areas, other articles, I think piecemeal. It's certainly all included in his book, Callous Disregard, but not anywhere near as succinct as this. This is a 15 to 20-minute video. I will play the whole thing because it's poignant. He is succinct in his responses to all of the allegations that have been he's been assaulted with. It have been aimed at him over this last now almost 2 decades. This started for Andy Wakefield back in 1998. And he, in this video, as I said, he deals with all of those allegations. In fact, the name of the video, and it's on YouTube, is called Dr. Andrew Wakefield Deals with Allegations. And he's about to start on number 1 with his background.
I'm a physician. I qualified in 1981. I went on to practice as a surgeon with a specific interest in inflammatory bowel disease. I then became an academic, running a team of 19 people researching inflammatory bowel disease, and published over the period of 10 years in the order of 130, 140 scientific publications on that particular subject. So on May the 17th, 1995, the date is emblazoned in my mind, a mother called me and said my child was developing perfectly normally. They had an MMR vaccine and they regressed into autism. And I said, I'm a gastroenterologist. How can I help you? And they said, my child has terrible gastrointestinal problems and no one will take them seriously. And the story was so compelling, and this mother was so articulate, described it so clearly, and said, Dr. Wakefield, there are many, many parents in my position, children in exactly the same condition as mine. And so we took it very seriously. And that was the beginning of a fascinating journey.
I will point out that those parents will all tell you that the many doctors and specialists, neurologists and such, with whom they had visited with their kids before coming to the Royal Free Hospital, and Dr. Andy Wakefield and Dr. Simon Walker and all the rest of the doctors and technicians who dealt with and treated and examined those 12 kids, that they were treated with disrespect, to say the least, at all of those other visits. They were told they were psychologically unstable. They were imagining it. Their kids were normal, developing with a slight glitch, perhaps, but wait it out, all the way up to get over it. Your kids will always be in need. They'll always be dependent on you for the rest of their life and will be institutionalized, will need to be institutionalized later on. Just get over it. Adjust to it. That's the type of reactions with which they were greeted at all those other visits until they spoke with not just Andy Wakefield, but other doctors here at the Royal Free Hospital and brought their kids to that team of 13 to be examined and treated. This is section 2 called The Link Between Autism and the MMR Vaccine.
The link between the syndrome we were seeing and MMR vaccine came from the parental story. The parents saying, I wasn't anti-vaccine, I took my child to be vaccinated with MMR on time. It was given in isolation at the time in the UK, so it was easy for them to pinpoint the MMR as what they believed to be the cause. And from that point forward, their child developed a very high fever, seizures, prolonged sleep, beyond which they woke up and they were never the same again. They lost speech and language, interaction with their siblings, and became profoundly unwell. So the way in which human disease syndromes are described, whether it's autism or Crohn's disease or Asperger's, is you have a collection of a handful of patients, sometimes no more than 4, sometimes as many as 15, where the presentation is so similar, the findings in the clinic are so similar, that these merit publication in their own right. And that's called a case series. And that is the way in which human disease syndromes are first described. And what that leads to are subsequent studies, which then test hypotheses of causation. Was the parents' stories right? Was it that the child did regress in the face of MMR, and was MMR the cause of the problem? So you can ask the question, well, not every child who gets MMR develops autism. So what is the risk? Why? Why these children and not these children? And one of our hypotheses was age of exposure. The younger you get the vaccine, the greater the risk. And the reason for putting that forward is that we know with infections like measles, the younger you get measles, the greater the risk of a serious outcome. So if you get measles under 1, the risk of serious disease following measles is much greater than if you get it over 1.
This is Section 3 MMR vaccine safety. And I will interject that the MMR autism study done by the CDC in 2002, which indeed is the focus of the film Vaxxed, was in response to what Andy Wakefield just mentioned, that they had looked at the correlation in all of their case studies of the incidence of autism versus the age at which the MMR vaccine had been administered. So once again, this is 3 MMR vaccine safety.
Now, by that stage, as a researcher, I had looked in great detail at the safety studies of MMR. I became very, very concerned that those studies were totally inadequate. Now, this is not just my opinion, because subsequently, what is called the Cochrane Review, which is one of the gold standard reviews of the medical literature, has come forward and said the same thing. And their words were that the safety studies, the pre-licensing safety studies of MMR vaccine were largely inadequate, particularly compared with the single vaccines. In other words, the safety studies of the single vaccines were better. For example, if I went to the Food and Drug Administration and I had 3 antihypertensive drugs, 3 blood pressure drugs, and I said, I've got these 3 drugs, I've got a license for each one individually, but I want to put them together in the same tablet. Can I just put the 3 licenses in a folder and hand it to you and get a license for the combined drug? They would throw me out the door, quite rightly. And they would say, come back when you have done a comparative study of every drug in combination with the other and compared them with the single drug for side effects, for adverse reactions. That should have been done with the MMR vaccine, and it was not. There were many assumptions made about the safety of this vaccine, and I believe that children are now paying the price for those assumptions.
And I will add that, indeed, the movie, which I had not seen, but I certainly have read about, says that the individual MM&R vaccines, measles, mumps, and rubella vaccines, because of the problems associated with the MMR, are preferable. But since then, Andy Wakefield, in one of the question and answer sessions following one of the screenings of Vaxxed, has literally said that were he to have another child, he and his wife obviously, that child would not be vaccinated. And I'm willing to bet that in that statement he would include the single measles vaccine. And we're off into a slightly other area, but an interesting one, but one to which we can get no definitive answers right now. So we will continue for a few moments with his responses. This is called for the Lancet paper.
The Lancet study itself arose out of seeing many of these children with the same presentation: normal development, regression, an autism spectrum diagnosis, gastrointestinal symptoms, and bowel inflammation. So it was putting that story together in one package and saying, here are the first 12 children that we've seen. This is what we find. This is remarkable, it's consistent, and it suggests the emergence of a new human disease syndrome. The parents report...
We'll hesitate for 2 minutes. Be right back.
Easy.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
And back to Andy Wakefield.
The regression occurred after MMR vaccine in many cases. That is now up for testing as a hypothesis.
And once again, that correlation, that connection with the symptoms of autism having been spurred by, having been noticeable, obviously, after the MMR vaccine came from the parents, not from the doctors. They were following up on the information given them by the parents. I believe 8 or 9 of the 12 children involved in the Lancet paper, that case series published in the Lancet, had reported the syndrome beginning after MMR vaccine. And it was important, too, what Andy mentioned, the fact that the MMR vaccine was given what he called in isolation in the UK at the time. There were no other vaccines given at that time along with it, the DTaP, the meningitis vaccines, etc. There weren't a combination of several vaccines given at one visit. When it came to the MMR, it was given in isolation, so the parents had no doubt about which vaccine was the culprit here. Back to Andy.
And subsequent studies should be done to actually elucidate whether that is true or not. So that was published as a case series in The Lancet in 1998, in February of that year. And a press briefing was held at the request of the Dean of the Medical School, and those findings were explained.
5, conflict of interest.
So in the UK, there was then litigation by children against the manufacturers of the drug. And I became involved in that litigation. And patients within the Lancet study also became involved. Once they got their diagnosis and they were convinced that this was what happened, then they joined the litigation. It was alleged that the study was done for the purpose of litigation. Indeed, that it was funded by lawyers for litigation. That is absolutely untrue. It simply was not. So I agreed to be a medical expert, and I feel obliged to act as a medical expert on their behalf, because there were any number of doctors lining up on the other side to be paid as experts to act on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry. One of the allegations against me is that I had acted on behalf of lawyers. I was being paid by lawyers to do the Lancet study. In fact, I was being paid for by a government-funded compensation program to act as a medical expert. It had nothing whatsoever to do with the Lancet study, which was paid for by the National Health Service. The payment from the Legal Aid Board was not to me initially, it was to the medical school to conduct a study to look for evidence of measles virus in the diseased intestine of these children. That is what it specifically did. This was known to the editor of The Lancet nearly a year before the paper was published. He was sent documents from the lawyer saying, we are working with Dr. Andy Wakefield on this issue. He knew or should have known, but conveniently, he forgot that fact when it came to testify before the General Medical Council under oath. And it was only subsequently that it was disclosed that he knew all along.
6, framing Dr. Wakefield.
When you had this threat of litigation, then they came down very, very hard. What happened was that a journalist by the name of Brian Deer, a freelance journalist working on behalf of News International, Rupert Murdoch, came after me and contrived a story, a fairy tale so fanciful of this evil doctor living in this mansion and wreaking havoc upon the children of the world in an attempt to profit and to make himself a legend in the history of medicine. It took my life story and rewrote it. And it was a strategy, a deliberate strategy, a public relations strategy to say, we discredit this man, we isolate him from his colleagues, we destroy his career. And then we say to other physicians who might dare to get involved in this, this is what will happen to you. And it's very, very sad because good doctors, honest doctors, said, Andy, I know this is right. I know it's right. And they wrote it was right. Internal communications confirmed their beliefs that it was right. But when it came to doing the right thing by these children, then it was not going to be good for their careers, and they stepped back. So it had the desired effect. Do I feel that I was framed by the pharmaceutical industry? Yes, I think I was. Why me in particular? I mean, there were 13 authors on that study, many of them the most eminent people in their field. They went after me because I joined in the litigation as an expert against the manufacturers. And I wrote to my colleagues that I can no longer support the continued use of this vaccine, MMR. I will continue to vigorously support the use of the single vaccines, the single measles, mumps, rubella, but cannot support the use of the triple vaccine. And I think it's because I put myself in that outspoken position that then they came after me in particular. Another allegation is that I was in my mountain lair secretly making this single vaccine, which was a competitor to MMR, would put MMR out of the market, discredit it, and then bring my own vaccine onto the market and clean up. That was the idea from Brian Deer. What we had at the time was a patent, medical school owned the patent, not me, and it was a patent on a thing called transfer factor. It's a naturally occurring nutritional supplement that occurs in breast milk, for example, that boosts the immune response. Whether it worked or not is another question. That's what we sought to try and find out. But it boosts the immune response to an infection like measles. This could not prevent children from getting measles. So it didn't act like MMR at all. What it did was to help them clear the virus once they became infected. It could never have competed with MMR vaccine, never, because it did not work in the right way. And this was explained in great detail to Brian Deer, and he completely ignored it. It remained that it was a competitor to MMR, and I was simply trying to clean up financially and put this onto the market. Brian Deer's association with the vaccine manufacturer, SmithKline Beecham, who went on to become GlaxoSmithKline, was a very close one, a very intimate relationship. He'd originally been a critic of their drug AZT, but had since been given exclusive rights to some of their adverse drug reaction data in some exchange, some deal that had gone on between them. And beyond that point, I believe he became their kind of attack dog. How could a single journalist achieve what Brian Deer achieved so effectively? It was the will of the government, it was the will of the pharmaceutical industry, and it was the will of the media. At that time, James Murdoch, son of Rupert Murdoch and part of News International, was on the board of GlaxoSmithKline as a non-executive director. And his job on the board of that vaccine manufacturer was to protect that industry's reputation in the media. So there was this very incestuous cabal involving government, media, and the industry that all wanted this outcome. So they were going to get it. And against them, there was me. Now, you accuse a researcher of fraud in 30 seconds, and it takes a lifetime to turn that around. And they know that. They know how vulnerable doctors are. Now, the fraud allegations were completely false. But you don't have to take my word for that. There's now been a thorough investigation and examination of the original data used in the Lancet paper by an ex-senior scientist from the Environmental Protection Agency, Dr. David Lewis. I'd never met him before. He took all of the original files and analyzed them and showed categorically and definitively that I had not been involved in any fraud at all, but the fraud had taken place on the part of Brian Deer and the British Medical Journal. They had fraudulently misrepresented our work at the Royal Free in order to achieve the effect that was ultimately achieved, and that is the perception worldwide that this study was fake, it was false, it was made up, and there is no substance to it.
Okay, I'll halt there for the moment. Two issues. Andy Wakefield pretty much virtually stated that the MMR does prevent measles, and I would argue with that. As I've presented many times on the show, we have various studies, two in particular. The first one literally called measles virus infection without rash in childhood associated with illness in adult life. And what it's pretty much pointing out is that the presence of measles virus-specific antibodies in the blood at the time of exposure, of natural exposure and subsequent infection with measles interferes with the common immunological response, and in this case, precludes the development of the rash. It goes on to say that that's problematic. What would seem a benefit on the surface is actually a problem, because apparently the rash is necessary in that specific instance, attendant a measles virus-specific infection, to completely, fully, thoroughly eliminate the virus from the body and bring you back to full, complete, effective recovery. And if the rash is not developed, is not present among the symptoms you develop, then that is likely to lead to a ruminating viral presence, which will lead to chronic disorders later in life. And we're talking about sebaceous skin disease, degenerative bone disease, and certain tumors. And the other thing I wanted to mention is, indeed, I have been in personal contact with another gastroenterologist who is making headway in corroborating Andy Wakefield's statements and discoveries, but refuses to be interviewed because exactly of the problems Andy Wakefield has experienced since. We'll be back after a 4-minute top-of-the-hour break.
Well, my baby was a child so strong. Healthy baby never did no wrong. Then we took her to that infant doctor.
Welcome back to the Vaccine Myth and Issue of Trust. It is still Sunday, May 29th, 2016, and I'm still your host, Sean Siegel. I will try to keep my comment about the tune to which we were listening on the way back in brief, but mention something I must, because we were listening to Michael Belkin sing about the death of his 5-week-old daughter, apparently at the time healthy, happy, vibrant, beautiful infant little girl, at death at the hands of an Hep B shot given at 5 weeks. And that took place within 15 hours. Keeping a long story short, what had been described by the coroner as brain damage that they detected in Lila Rose, a little girl, was completely either omitted from the medical record or deleted from, even worse, the medical record, and the little girl's death was listed as sudden infant death syndrome, while we certainly know here on this show, the listening audience, that vaccines can indeed damage the brain. And that's a situation, obviously, in which we still find ourselves. Okay, we're going to go back to Andy Wakefield. We're more than halfway through, and his explanations are so succinct and poignant, and he touches every facet of the allegations that were brought against him back in, I believe, 2008 or 9 or so. And this section is called Blood Samples.
Yes, the blood samples at my son's birthday party. In order to study the children with autism, we were examining their blood samples. We needed blood samples from healthy children. And, of course, in hospital, you don't see healthy children. You see children who are sick. And so my wife suggested that we have a birthday party coming up. Maybe we can get some blood from our children at the birthday party. And I thought that was a reasonable idea. It was done with fully informed child and parental consent. Fully informed. It was entirely ethical. It was no worse, for example, than going to CVS and having a shot. In fact, probably substantially better. And it was done by a highly experienced general practitioner, not by me. And there were no problems at all. The only problem was that it did not have an approval from the Hospital Ethics Committee. That does not make it unethical. It was done, as I say, with fully informed child and parental consent. So that's the story. Do I regret it? Yes. Not because it was unethical, it wasn't, but because it gave the General Medical Council a concrete reason for then taking away my license. It was a mistake, and if I did it again, I would do so with the appropriate ethical approval. And so, therefore, it's something I regret. But was it at any stage unethical? No.
8. Retraction of the Lancet paper.
The Lancet paper was withdrawn on the basis of 2 allegations. One, that the children were sequentially investigated. In other words, these are children who came in one after another. And what that means is you're not saying we took just the children we wanted because they told us the story we wanted to hear and we left out the others. You take them sequentially so you include all the children, and it avoids bias. And that is the correct way to do it. The other reason is that it was claimed by Brian Deer and subsequently the GMC that there was no ethical approval. In America, investigation or institutional review board approval for the study itself. It was a clinical study. It didn't need ethical approval, but the analysis of the biopsies from the intestine did. And there was ethical approval. And that was in Deer's hands when he made the allegation, and he deliberately withheld that information from the General Medical Council. It was an obstruction of justice.
9. Medical license.
The licensing board for doctors in the UK is called the General Medical Council. And you are judged by your peers in medicine and some lay people as well. At the GMC, there were 3 defendants. Professor Walker Smith, who was at the time the world's leading pediatric gastroenterologist, a very senior man with an impeccable record, an unimpeachable career. One of his juniors, Dr. Simon Murch, and myself. All 3 of us were found guilty. Simon Murch did not lose his license, but Walker Smith and I lost our license. He was then funded to appeal in the English High Court. I did appeal, but for financial reasons, it was impossible for me to pursue that, and it was not a primary objective after that, to restore my license. There were more important things to do. But Professor Walker Smith did appeal, And at that appeal, the first time this case had ever come before a proper judiciary, a proper judge, and the judge destroyed the General Medical Council's decision. He said effectively they were incompetent. They were not in a position to judge the evidence, that they made mistakes, they got the facts wrong, they misrepresented the evidence, and worst of all, they were biased. They had made up their minds from the outset that we were guilty. And he completely overturned their decision and said, in effect, this must never happen again. Walker Smith was completely reinstated, and all charges against him utterly dismissed. 90% of the charges against Walker Smith were the same charges as those against me. The paper should have been reinstated, and yet the Lancet editor refused to do that in order to protect his reputation and his job. So, did that ever find its way into the newspapers? Briefly. One newspaper. Big story, very little mention. You don't hear about that now. All you hear about is that we were discredited, had our licenses removed, the paper was retracted. But the real story has yet to be told.
Okay, and the editor-in-chief of the Lancet also testified at the hearing, at the General Medical Council hearing, that the science of the paper that they had published and then retracted was good. Apparently, the attorneys were hoping to hear other words from the editor, but despite the fact that, as Andy just mentioned, he would not reinstate or republish the paper once all those charges had been, or 90% of the charges had been thrown out by the appellate judge in the case of Dr. Walker Smith, it made no difference. He still wouldn't put the paper back into the Lancet. Nevertheless, he did testify at the General Medical Council that the science of the paper was good. This is 10, and I believe the final section, consequences.
Well, it's very interesting because at the time, I made a recommendation that parents should opt for the use of the single vaccines. In other words, not protect their children against these infections, but they should have the option of how to do it. And at that time, in the UK and the US, the single vaccines were available. So the parents could choose. I'm not happy about MMR, but I want to vaccinate my child, so I will opt for the single vaccines. And they protect perfectly well, for example, against measles. So that option was available to them. I would not have made that recommendation if that were not the case. And so in the UK, 6 months later, the government withdrew the importation license for the single vaccines. In the US, some years later, Merck unilaterally stopped the production of the single vaccines. I mean, they make them individually to put them together, but they stopped making them available in the marketplace so that it was MMR or nothing, our way or the highway. And that deprived parents of the choice. They were still concerned about MMR, so they didn't vaccinate. Measles then came back. It was entirely their fault. And as I say in the movie, I asked a senior member of the Department of Health, why would you do that? If you want to protect children against serious infectious disease, why would you take away an option of that, of how parents might do that? She said, because if we allow parents the choice, then it will destroy our MMR program. In other words, the concern was for the protection of the program and not the children.
And I have to point out again, I'm at odds with Andy Wakefield consistently on this point, at least how he consistently expresses himself in the various question and answer sessions and his articles in this video and pretty much in all public appearance of any kind, written or audio or visual, until apparently that question and answer session I mentioned before, in which he did say, and this only took place a few weeks ago, that were he to have a child now, his family to have another child, he would not vaccinate. But no, protecting kids against measles in reality means instructing families on how to best nurture and support the immune system. And if they get the measles, how to treat it primarily with vitamin A, which is necessary in those kids who have a problem with sensitivity to light. That happens in some cases, not all. I don't know the percentages. I'm assuming that it's probably something on the order of 10 to 20%. I have no way to know for sure. But yes, many kids become sensitive to light. When they have measles, they have to have sunglasses and or have the shades drawn, etc. But that's about the extent of the complications, unless you're malnourished or have some other significant compromise of your immune system. And the protection that vaccines Even the single measles vaccine supposedly provides, it does not. As I mentioned before, it's as likely as not, I think there's about a 20% or so possibility that if you have been vaccinated for measles or then exposed to the disease, that the presence of those vaccine-induced antibodies will preclude the display of the rash, and that is problematic. Not only does it cause you problems later in life, but since respiratory symptoms are experienced and measles is transmitted through respiration, you are very likely I'm trying to think of the Roman version. You are a surreptitious disease vector infecting your family and all those around you. Trojan horse is what I was trying to think of. So you become the very surreptitious disease vectors we're told we are. Hang on.
This is the Logos Radio Network.
Understand that the foundational falsity of the vaccine paradigm is the notion that disease is an enemy. That under normal conditions, when someone is adequately fed and adequately housed, disease is an essential recuperative process, an essential cleansing and recuperative process. It becomes problematic indeed in those or in populations whose diet is inadequate and or whose living conditions are squalid and inadequate. And vaccination, the injection of disease, known neurotoxins, other toxins, carcinogens, undigested proteins, and who knows what dangerous contaminants. The reason that does not sound like a rational solution to malnutrition or squalor is simply because it isn't. Now let's get back to the closing minute of Dr. Andy Wakefield's response to allegations.
And that was a disastrous mistake. Measles came back. It was entirely their responsibility. But, of course, it was blamed on me.
Okay, that's not. I have to put it in. He said that was a disastrous consequence of people not getting the MMR vaccine is that measles came back. And I'm saying, no, that's not a disaster. That's a natural ebb and flow of infection and disease and cleanse and nurturing and maturing of individual immune systems. As in essence, nature prepares each of us individually for successful adulthood.
They quote the fall in MMR uptake in the UK. What they do not quote is the reciprocal increase in the use of the single vaccines before it was withdrawn.
Outlook. This indeed is the last section.
Well, I won't pretend that this has been easy at all, but the medical imperative is utterly compelling, and whenever I get to feel a little bit sorry for myself because of the GMC or something someone has said in the media, then I only need to look at the next child with autism to realize that actually I don't have a problem. I have 4 healthy children, a wonderful family. There's no autism in my family. I look at the next child with autism and I think that child has a problem. I don't have a problem, so get over yourself, get on with it, and get the job done.
Okay, there we have it. And what a thorough and succinct explanation of all of the allegations brought against Dr. Wakefield back in the 2009 or 10 General Medical Council hearing in the UK and his responses to them, all of which make sense, all of which from everything I've been able to determine through the entire course of the 7 years of vaccine research is absolutely valid. And everything he said has been validated in at least 1 or 2, if not many, many other studies. Dr. Arthur Krigsman, a local and not so local, he has offices both in New York and Austin, Texas, pediatric gastroenterologist. He corroborated using the state-of-the-art technology about 2 years ago, Dr. Wakefield's theory in his Lancet published case series that they had discovered a new infection, a new bowel disease, a novel bowel disease, and Dr. Krigsman corroborated that. technically, scientifically. But the unavoidable and unarguable corroboration comes from those thousands of parents who, as was stated by Dr. Wakefield in the video, and so often by so many others, who have witnessed, who have seen for themselves, who provide their anecdote, their eyewitness account of their healthy kids going in for sometimes just the MMR and sometimes a round of other vaccines and coming out obviously significant and sorely affected, and too often affected in a way that proves to be but the first step down the road of regression, ultimately to a diagnosis of autism. And what I'll point out is the very first question I asked Andy Wakefield in his first of several interviews on this show, which was, could you speak, please, to the success you had in alleviating the autism symptoms in the kids that you treated for their inflamed bowels? And he was delighted to respond to that one. He said, yes, indeed. When the kids were treated for their inflamed bowels, certainly varying in degree from one child to another, nonetheless, there were telltale improvements. In some cases, kids who had not spoken for months or years began to speak again. And poignantly, when they began to speak, they spoke with the intelligence of the age at which they were when they were being treated, instead of the intelligence at which they were at the age at which they had lost their speech. What I'm saying is that during those months or years of apparent absence, the kids were aware that somewhere amidst the pain they were feeling, they were aware and they were still learning. After said treatments, kids who had not recognized their loved ones, their parents, their siblings for a very long time, once again began bonding with them, etc. Those are the results. Those are the consequences of the treatment those 12 kids received at the hands of the Royal Free Hospital team of doctors and technicians that should have been trumpeted worldwide and wasn't. Instead, we saw nothing but the repeated vilification of Dr. Andy Wakefield specifically and personally. And it was all manufactured by the pharmaceutical industry. Cooperating was the government and the newspapers and reporter Brian Deere, who acted as the front man for this assault on Andy Wakefield, as well as certainly the others involved. And like you said, Dr. Murch was brought up in front of the hearing. Dr. Walker Smith was. Dr. Murch kept his license, but the other two doctors lost theirs. And then Walker Smith was exonerated in the appellate hearing. And as Andy Wakefield said, 90% of the charges brought against Dr. Walker Smith, which were in essence thrown out by the appellate court, were also brought against Andy Wakefield. Okay, that was called Dr. Wakefield Responds to Allegations, I believe, or Dr. Andrew Wakefield. It's on YouTube. That's a very worthwhile video, especially to provide and to send a link to anyone who still comes across with the absurd myth of Andy's misdoings and misdeeds. Okay, I wanted to speak just for a brief moment before we go down to the bottom of the hour break on the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations. If you go to look up the Council on Foreign Relations, you'll find somewhere in their history, I don't have it on the screen at the moment, but in the past, they work with, in essence, Agenda 21, the United Nations Agenda 21, in concert with at the head of the pyramid, the top of the pyramid, the banking elite of the world. And they implement the strategies that will accomplish the goals of Agenda 21 ultimately. And in so doing, they have become, the members of the Council on Foreign Relations have become members of the executive boards of virtually all the media, the newspapers, the mainstream TV stations, I'm sure on mainstream radio networks as well. And that's where much of the control over vaccine information emanates, the control with which we are oh so familiar. Be back in 3 minutes.
The Chicago Blackhawks stunned the hockey world by coming out of nowhere to win the Western Conference Finals. Their secret weapon was a readily available health supplement. I'm Dr. Catherine Albrecht, and I'll be right back to tell you how they did it.
Google is watching you, recording everything you've ever searched for and creating a massive database of your personal information. That's creepy, but it doesn't have to be that way. Startpage.com is the world's most private search engine. Startpage.com doesn't store your IP address, make a record of your searches, or use tracking cookies, and they're third-party certified. If you don't like Big Brother spying on you, start over with Startpage. Great search results and total privacy. Startpage.com, the world's most private search engine.
What shot the Blackhawks to victory? Vitamin D. When team members took a daily supplement, they caught fewer colds, recovered faster from injuries, and their game took off. And it's not just athletes who can benefit. Your body makes vitamin D when sunlight hits your skin, but adults who work indoors and kids who watch a lot of TV probably don't get enough, putting them at risk for illness, bone problems, and even heart disease. Be sure you and your kids get 10 to 15 minutes of sun exposure several times a week, or ask your doctor about a daily natural vitamin D supplement. You can learn more about this amazing vitamin at vitamindcouncil.org. This is Dr. Catherine Albrecht. More news and information at catherinealbrecht.com.
This may not actually be kidding about chemtrails.
Looking for some truth? You found it. LogosRadioNetwork.com.
I want to stay on this detour for a minute. I was talking about the CFR for just a minute before we broke. And I want to bring up now an organization called ALEC, A-L-E-C. I will read from their website under About. The American Legislative Exchange Council, that's ALEC, is America's largest nonpartisan voluntary membership organization of state legislators dedicated to the principles of limited government, free markets, and federalism. Comprised of nearly 1/4 of the country's state legislators, 1/4. Comprised of nearly 1/4 of the country's state legislators and stakeholders from across the policy spectrum, ALEC members represent more than 60 million Americans and provide jobs to more than 30 million people in the United States. Well, malarkey. They're dedicated to the principle of lobbying influence. I'm going to go now to, I don't know what mainstream station this was, but they covered ALEC in its operations. We'll go there right now.
Show you what's behind this closed door. A place where legislators and corporate lobbyists have an equal vote. A place they don't want you to see.
You need to be credentialed.
We are credentialed. We are Georgia. We're Georgia Media. Are there legislators in there? Are there legislators in there? We are Georgia credentialed media.
Here? Please step over here.
What?
Okay, they're in a hotel, and this fellow he's saying, I'm credentialed. He has a microphone in his hand, and this woman was about to walk in the door, and he's saying, are the legislators in there? Are our representatives and senators in there? And this is in a hotel conference room. And she's saying, as soon as he asked that, as a knee-jerk reaction, come with me. And she started walking down the hallway.
There's Georgia legislators here. Are laws being made in there?
This isn't the state capitol. It's a resort hotel in Savannah where lawmakers are wined and dined as members of the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC.
What is ALEC?
It's really a corporate bill mill. I mean, they're cranking out legislation, putting it in the hands of legislators who go back and file it.
Georgia Senator Nan Orrick would know. She was once an ALEC member.
What happens in these back rooms?
There are votes taken that have the corporate folks at the same table voting with the legislators on what bills to pick. And that at its core just screams out inappropriate.
You're telling me that in these rooms, a corporation has an equal vote with a legislator on a piece of legislation?
They absolutely vote, and the truth be told, they write the bills.
ALEC bills come complete with blanks where legislators need only fill in their state name, like the Asbestos Claims Priorities Act. This Georgia law that now prevents many asbestos victims from suing corporations matches the ALEC bill clause after clause, often word for word. The final vote was taken here at the Georgia Capitol, but the bill was first approved here. inside a Las Vegas casino at a closed-door ALEC meeting. Records show the 3 Georgia senators who sponsored the bill received more than $22,000 in ALEC scholarships to attend resort meetings the year before, during, and after the asbestos law was passed.
This is money from corporations to legislators, but it's being filtered through ALEC, and they get a tax write-off?
Well, ALEC is a 501c3 organization, charitable educational purposes.
That's right. ALEC is an educational charity. The signature of Georgia's Speaker of the House, David Ralston, appears on this 2013 ALEC fundraising letter. He writes, "Your support of the scholarship fund is critical, enabling Georgia legislators to attend the annual meetings. Donations are 100% tax deductible and fund education efforts for legislators."
Yeah, teaching them what bills need to be put in front of the legislature, excuse me. This is as un-American, undemocratic, unrepresentative as you can possibly get.
Who's doing the educating? Inside that closed-door committee room in Savannah we couldn't show you, we saw the lobbyist for the cell phone industry seated across from Georgia State Rep Ben Harbin right before we were pulled out.
Here we're credentialed to observe legislators here in Georgia, wherever they meet, to discuss laws. He's calling for backup.
ALEC staffers had 4 off-duty sheriff's deputies standing by while we talked with the group's director of communications.
Can we do an interview with you?
Actually, no.
Why not?
If you please turn the camera off.
No, we can't turn the camera off. That's one thing we don't do.
Okay, well then I'd like to have you escorted out of the building, please.
Okay, I'm a guest of this hotel. I'm actually staying here at this hotel.
You are staying at this hotel.
So here's the question is, if Georgia legislators are meeting here, we're credentialed right here to see Georgia legislators making laws. Are they discussing things that could become law here?
Georgia legislators are here participating in discussions, or they're learning from legislators from others.
So why can't the people who elected them see the process?
This is a private meeting.
A private meeting paid for by whom?
By our members and donors.
Our lobbyists, correct?
No.
Are you here for this conference too? Are you a legislator?
We met 2 lobbyists and a state representative from New England in the hotel bar the night before and recorded our conversation.
You have to pay your own way?
Well, on a trip like this, that's where you would come in, man. On a trip like this, I'm a state chair about it.
Yeah.
And I look for financial support.
Right.
Lobbyists, people like, send us like a couple $1,000 every so often. That gives me money to help those folks with. Now, the other hand,
we pay more here, so it helps support them.
And you do.
I see. So the lobbyist fees to come to the event actually help subsidize the legislator coming here.
Our lobbyists, correct?
No.
They're not lobbyists? The ones that we recorded in the bar last night aren't lobbyists who are here members?
He signals to the sheriff's deputies.
All right, I'm a guest of the hotel, sir.
Not for long.
I'm here, a paying guest of this hotel, sir.
We'll take care of that.
Escort you up to your room and get your things.
Did we violate some law or something? I mean, are we violating a law here? Don't say nothing. One of the Georgia senators who sponsored that asbestos bill, Renee Unterman, told the 11 Alive investigators she later dropped out of ALEC, calling it a group of angry white men controlled by industry, not legislators. Major corporations like Atlanta-based Coca-Cola have also dropped out of ALEC.
Wow, eye-opening to say the least. Do lawmakers have to report payments for travel to these kinds of resort meetings?
You would think, Brenda, but in Georgia, the answer is no. We filed 6 open records requests with Georgia legislators, including the Speaker of the House asking for receipts and reimbursements to ALEC events. Well, today we received this letter from their lawyer. Your request is denied. Quote, the General Assembly is not subject to the Georgia Open Records Law. In other words, lawmakers specifically exempted themselves from a law they passed to make Georgia government more transparent.
It's a good thing you made it out there. The guards were standing for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, that's fitting enough at the end of that one. Georgia legislators, they exempted themselves from laws specifically made and geared toward making Georgia government more transparent. So they didn't have to answer the questions that these reporters duly sent them. That this would be laughable if it weren't so severely affecting all of us. And I can equate that with the vaccine world quite easily. We have we don't need educational councils, what a euphemism that is, in the world of vaccines. The pharmaceutical industry simply keeps, along with the cooperation of the Department of Defense, with the Federal Drug Association, FDA, they simply develop these vaccines, make their own reports, give the reports to the FDA. The FDA does not repeat the experiments or the trials. They simply take the word of the vaccine manufacturers and almost as a matter of simple course approve the vaccines for licensure. And more often than not, those vaccines are compared against other vaccines as though the other vaccine were an appropriate placebo, when it's not a placebo at all. A placebo is a non-reactive substance, such as, which is classically used, saline solution. But in virtually every single case, such actual placebos are not used. The comparators are the previous year's vaccine minus the disease agent, the disease antigen, or even just the aluminum adjuvant used. It's a preposterous situation. We'll be back after this final 2 minutes.
Easy.
I want to read a letter that is styled as first-hand observations from a registered nurse. I do not have personal knowledge of this registered nurse, but we have had in the relative recent past, Bob, the emergency room registered nurse, who told us himself of, and these he described afterwards as repeated instances of a boy that had been brought in a state of status epilepticus, continuing ongoing seizure, and that he had been told by the EMR technician that the young boy had been vaccinated only a couple of hours before, and he put that in his, the registered nurse, Bob, put that in his own notes, and when the MD arrived, a woman MD arrived to treat the patient, she walked in the room, and the mother of the young boy, because she had heard all the conversations going on, asked the doctor if there were any logical reason they should suspect the vaccines is causing this, and the MD said, no, absolutely not. And the MD went on to omit any mention of the fact that the boy had been vaccinated only 2 hours before he'd been picked up by the EMS. In her report to the next doctor, a neurologist, to whom the boy would be taken, the next specialist who would see the boy, who obviously certainly should have been made aware that vaccines apparently were a large factor, certainly should be suspected as being a large factor in his status epilepticus. She refused. And it was only Bob, the nurse, who at the end of this whole affair sat down at a computer and filed a VAERS report, because the attending physician who should have been filing the report obviously was not going to. She wouldn't even acknowledge any correlation or a possibility of correlation. And we've had Michelle James on the air, and she's been on many shows, a pediatric nurse specialist, telling us of the repeated instances of infants being brought to the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit, because of severe respiratory problems experienced after vaccination. So there's no reason to doubt the validity of this firsthand observation from an RN. I used to be a vaccine believer simply because I knew on a very superficial level vaccines prevent disease. I had never researched them before, but that's what we hear as a general knowledge topic. When I started working in pediatrics, the sheer number of parents calling in terrified about their children's behavior after being vaccinated and the doctor's dismissive attitude to their concerns piqued my interests. I started asking questions to the drug reps when they came in, and they either full-on said they didn't know the answer, there was no data, or made a generic, in parentheses, false, statement about the vaccine. Then I was told by the doctors not to ask questions. All they need to know is the insurance reimbursement amount. As time went on, I noticed we were constantly seeing patients for sick visits shortly after they received shots. I ran a report using our billing software and found over 80%, I believe it was 82%, of the children who received shots came back for a sick visit within 10 days. I'll repeat that. 82% of the children who received shots came back for a sick visit within 10 days. That's an enormous percentage. These were upper respiratory infections, coughs, fevers, ear infections, overall just sick stuff. Of course, children get sick, but I found the high proportion soon after getting shots interesting. So do I. During my time in pediatrics, while I did work for a doctor who did accept non-vaccinating families, I also saw how staff were instructed to lie about vaccines being required for school and daycare for financial reasons. To lie. Being instructed to lie. The difference between the insurance reimbursement for a fully vaccinated early childhood visit and a vaccine-free well child visit was $400 plus, about $50, versus $50 for a vaccine-free well child visit. There were a handful of times patients had severe enough and immediate enough reactions to vaccines that 911 was called. One that stands out in particular was an obnoxiously outspoken pro-vaccine mom brought in her 12-year-old son against her husband's wishes for his first HPV shot. While checking out at the front desk, within about 20 minutes of his shot, the boy fell to the ground and had a seizure lasting about 3 minutes. It ended just before the paramedics arrived. He spent a couple days in a coma and just over a week in the hospital. Another time, a two-month-old baby girl left the office after her shots and was rushed back into the office by her parents not 10 minutes later. She had completely stopped breathing. The ambulance was called, CPR and oxygen was given. She did not die, but was severely brain damaged after that. VAERS is an important tool, and doctors are required by law to report all possible vaccine reactions. And VAERS, of course, is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System maintained by the CDC. They don't report. Many, many times I asked the doctors if, how, when they would be filing the report. I even asked how I should get the report started for them to make it less time consuming. Yet when they actually know what VAERS was, they always sort of scoffed and dismissed it. While my experiences and time spent researching make me confident in never vaccinating myself or my children, I am not anti-vaccines. I believe in informed choice. My risk factors for certain diseases may be different than yours. Your experiences may be more on the danger of diseases than danger of the vaccines. I could argue that with her immediately. I am anti three commonly held beliefs of many people who are adamantly pro-vaccine. One, the belief that vaccines are mandatory to attend school or daycare. Exemptions are available. Well, unfortunately, and as we know, in California, Mississippi, and West Virginia, non-medical exemptions are not available. Two, that non-vaccinated people are walking biohazards and need to be avoided at all costs. And as an example, she puts in the majority of the adult population is under or non-vaccinated based on the current vaccine schedule. Three, the refusal to acknowledge that vaccine injuries can and do happen and that they can be devastating and far more expensive, dangerous, and deadly than many other vaccine-preventable diseases. Well, again, and always, the vaccine-preventable diseases are in essence universally benign. And benign means, in reference to disease, a disease in which complications are not expected and complete recovery is usual. It does not mean a disease that never, ever kills anybody, because that is an impossibility. There is no such thing, because complications and death don't follow the virus or bacteria. They follow the person or the population in those nations where malnutrition and squalor is rampant. The problem that should be addressed in every single nation, in every household, is that of malnutrition, inadequate housing, squalid living, or other compromise of the immune system, serious compromise, because even those in moderately good health will have little or no problem recovering from the process of recuperation, if you will, what we call disease, from measles, mumps, rubella, or any of the other vaccine-associated diseases. And anyone who is seriously enough immunocompromised, and this was before the advent of the measles vaccine, for instance, 1 in 10,000 cases had to have been in such sad shape that they likely would also have experienced either complications or death from chicken pox or mumps or even the common cold. Yes, people do die sometimes from the common cold. Again, obviously because there is something else seriously deficient in their immune response or some terribly egregious method of treatment used. And that's a possibility too. Though what would be much more suspect would be the overall status of their health when they were infected. Disease, again, is in essence a cleansing, recuperative process. And yet, the entire foundational motivation of vaccination is to eliminate that essential process. It's bonkers. And it's mean and it's nasty. They're aware of everything I've said. Vaccine myth and issue of trust. We'll be back next week.